Welcome to Commander Central, episode 144, and today we'll be taking a look at Patreon supporter Brad Lim's Ghalta Primal Hunger deck. I'm Dana.
And I'm Max.
Max, let's talk about some Commander.
Let's do it.
How was your weekend, first of all?
It was a weekend. It was fun. I attended a bachelorette party for a good friend of mine last night.
Oh, nice.
I'm working on getting better today.
Okay, all right. So nothing too crazy happened since you're not in jail. It obviously was good, clean fun had by all.
Yes.
Good to hear. All right. Mine wasn't too terribly exciting either. I did get to play a game. I wanted to quick mention just because it was kind of a ridiculous situation. I was going against a Rowan and Kenrith Super Friends deck, and the person playing Rowan and Will at one point had 8 planeswalkers out, and they were...
What?
Yeah, because the way Rowan works, one of her abilities reduces the cost of planeswalkers and creatures, I think, by 2. And, he had ramped a good bit anyway, just had hit a couple mana rocks, was able to drop, a bunch of walkers in 2 turns, and just no one was able to get through with answers. And basically it came back to me, and I'm in my head doing some math, because I had also gotten out the Tezzeret that has a 0, lets you draw 2 cards if you control 3 artifacts. So I'm like, okay, I have a top deck chance, and then I can Tezzeret and draw 2 more, so I can draw 3 cards. What are the odds I hit my Demonic Tutor or my Elder Spell? I'm trying to calculate it out. And I didn't hit it on the draw step, but with my 2 draws off Tezzeret, I hit the Elder Spell and was able to kill 8 planeswalkers. 8 of his, 1 additional player had 1 out, and then I put 18 counters on my Tezzeret.
Wow.
And then which got killed before I could do it, because I couldn't ult him because I had to use his ability to draw down to hit the Elder Spell.
Yep.
So I couldn't do anything with it, and then the next turn, I can't remember if it was a Hero's Downfall or what it was, but somebody killed Tezzeret before I could do anything with it. But, you don't care at that point. If you kill that many Planeswalkers and Elder Spell, that feels pretty good.
Yeah, for sure.
So I've still been liking that card, and we do have to do, I think we did a show where we talked about our changes, and we were going to go back through and talk about them sometime after Eldraine, so we'll do that at some point coming up here in the next few weeks, and that was one of the ones I wanted to touch on again, and I've still been pretty happy with Elder Spell.
Nice.
So, any last minute news or things we want to talk about here before we get into this deck tech? I think we have we have a couple contests that are nearing their end here.
Yeah, so on Twitter, we are giving away those 5 MTG wristbands we picked up at GP Vegas. So find that tweet and retweet and follow us, and you'll get entered to win that. And then if you support us on Patreon or continue to support us on Patreon by the end of the month, you'll be entered in to win the Ultimate Guard Mountain Playmat. Nice.
All right. So, deck tech action. Let's do this. Ghalta, Primal Hunger. Have you played against a Ghalta deck, Max?
A couple times.
Okay. Is there one in our shop? I don't think I've seen one in the shop, at least.
There was a long time ago, but I don't think they play in our shop anymore.
And I've been walking through, at Vegas or at GP and seen Ghalta decks being played, but I don't think I've ever actually played against a Ghalta deck.
They're fun. They're fun to play against, but it's kind of a one-trick pony there.
To a degree, yeah. But, that's kind of Green's deal. It's kind of the greenest of the green commanders. It's the stompiest of the stompy things. So
very true.
I kind of appreciate that. So this is a deck we got in from listener and Patreon supporter Brad Lim. And if you want to support us like Brad did, you can find us on patreon.com/CMDRCentral and support the show any way you would like, up to, if you can help us out at $1 a month, we would appreciate that. And if you want to get a deck tech, that is an option in there as well. The first question we asked Brad was what his meta was like. He says he has a huge range of different decks. It's 10 to 15 people with power levels ranging from 2s to 10s. There are fresh precons to CEDH level decks. And when everyone sits down in a pod, they usually play a deck powered to what everyone else is playing. So they keep things relatively even. If a precon is level 2 and a top tier CDH deck is 10, he'd say this is a solid 8. We ask what the goal of the deck was. The goal was to ramp as much as possible until he can explode in one turn and just win instantly. And usually it gets there with mana doublers and mass land ramp. He can usually go off and win anywhere between turns 5 and 7. And Food Chain and Greater Good do a lot of work here, helping him dig through his deck to get to Concordant Crossroads or Triumph of the Horde.
Yep, and then we also follow that up with what are the weaknesses of the deck. He says he hasn't come across much weaknesses. Decks that usually beat this one are decks that are just faster by the power of their commanders. And he thinks he's made this deck as fast as possible. Sometimes he can get Ghalta out by turn 2 or 3. He said, board wipes don't bother me. I usually have enough card draw or lands and artifacts out to recover faster than everybody else. When asking about budget, he says there is no budget restrictions. It's his pet deck, so if we can find cards that we think could make it better, he will definitely try picking them up. And then the final note he did say was he has sacrificed removal in the deck for speed. He'd rather be the threat on the table over removing other people's things. I like it. That's aggressive.
Well, and to be honest, in green, you have artifact and enchantment removal, but like that's really it unless you want to run fight effects. So there's a couple of removal options in here, and I don't even think he's necessarily shortchanging himself that much. First things first, let's read Ghalta, because it's been a little bit since that card came out. It's been a hot minute. Ghalta Primal Hunger is 10 green, 12 mana total for a legendary creature, Elder Dinosaur. Ghalta Primal Hunger costs X less to cast, where X is the total power of creatures you control, and it has Trample and is a 12/12. So pretty frequently, I'm betting this is being cast as a 12/12 with Trample for double green.
That's scary. Again, very scary.
That is an absolute beating if that comes down fast. I mean, you can't even, you have to remove it or you're just going to get domed and die in 2 turns.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm 99% sure this is how it works. The reduction affects commander attacks too, correct?
Yes, it does. Yep.
Okay.
So as long as he keeps putting beaters on board, that it's probably just going to cost 2 really, really frequently to cast Ghalta.
Yeah.
I can appreciate that because I run it in my Recce deck, and it almost always just costs 2.
Or you hit it with Genesis Wave.
Yes, right. Yeah. I'm okay with that as well. Land base, 35 lands here, and I can go over these. There's an Ancient Tomb, there's a Cavern of Souls, a Dryad Arbor, a Hall of the Bandit Lord, a Homeward Path, a couple of different original good fetch lands like Misty Rainforest. There's a Mosswort Bridge, a Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx, a Reliquary Tower, a Temple of the False God. So, what do you think of the mana base, Max?
Did you talk about how many basics are in here?
Oh yeah, I did. I didn't. There's 22 basics, and they are snow-covered forests.
There we go.
So because that is relevant to the extraplanar lens later on.
Yeah. This is exactly what I would expect to see from a competitive mono green deck. You have all your colorless mana that, like Ancient Tomb, you lose some life, but you make a bunch of mana. Hall of the Bandit Lord, one of my favorite cards. A haste enabler, so you can dome someone for 12 right away with Ghalta. Just seems really good.
There's a couple things I maybe don't like. I will mention a few here. You said some good ones. Hall of the Bandit Lord's a great card in general. This is a good deck for it when you're playing that fast. We've talked about Cavern of Souls in the past plenty of times where we basically said if it was a $5 card, I would have it in every single deck. It's worth it just to name your commander's type to make sure it never gets countered. It's not a $5 card, however, but he had one, so it's in this deck. And I think if you have Cavern of Souls and it's the deck you play a lot, I mean, why would you not run it just to make sure your commander doesn't get countered, particularly when it's a commander that people are going to want to counter, like Ghalta.
Yeah.
Dryad Arbor is one I kind of question here. What are your thoughts on it?
It's a 1/1 body. It's a mana dork. It works. I like it. It reduces Ghalta, and then can tap for that green if needed.
That's true. It does reduce Ghalta. There is no Green Sun Zenith, so you don't get the cool turn 1 play where that really makes Dryad Arbor kind of extra juicy when you can go grab it on T1 to do that Green Sun Zenith for 0. There also isn't a Crater Hoof in here, which is something that cares about kind of going wide when it comes to punch people in the face. So, like, it does offset Ghalta's cost by 1, but it also can't be tapped for mana the turn it comes into play. It's essentially an ETB tapped land, functionally in terms of how it produces mana. It also doesn't work with with his mana doublers like Extraplanar Lens. I'm going to suggest another one later on it doesn't work with. And then it dies the first time you cast a board wipe. My thoughts, I think there are plenty of reasons to run Dryad Arbor, and I don't know if there's enough of them in this deck. I think a Green Sun Zenith is probably enough to put it over the top, because like you said, it does reduce Ghalta's cost. I think if you have a Crater Hoof in here and it's one more thing that adds to Crater Hoof's, lethal swing, then I think that makes sense. And I think if you were to add 1 or 2 of those things, I think it's justified. I think as it stands right now, my guess is it's going to die to a board wipe in a way that hurts you more often than it reducing that mana cost by 1 or it being a chump blocker or whatever helps you. So,
yeah, nope, that's a great assessment, and that makes a lot of sense. Now that you point out there's no Green Sun Zenith or anything to help get that out right away.
Yeah, and that's kind of the same thing. Like, I feel the same way about the artifact lands. I was in a conversation today online about it, and somebody said that Seat of the Synod and I can't remember which other land they were talking about are just upside. They're artifact lands that tap for a blue, they don't come into play tapped, and they can feed Metalcraft or they can feed Affinity or whatever it is. But they do have a downside. Like, if someone casts a Vandal Blast, you lose your artifact lands. I'm not saying to don't run artifact lands, because I run a couple of them in different decks, but you have to have multiple reasons. I think one reason probably isn't enough. You need to have multiple things that they feed in a deck to take the risk that you're going to lose 1 or 2 lands to a Vandal Blast or a Shattering Spree or whatever. I think the same thing is true of Dryad Arbor. You need to have multiple reasons it is useful in your deck, and I think right now this current configuration might be 1 or 2 of those short. So just my thought there on that. Temple of the False God. Are you still okay with that one, Max?
I still run it. So yeah, in a monocolored deck, I don't see a reason not to run it, especially we're in green. He's ramping fast enough where I think it's never going to be a dead card in your hand.
And you can probably get around it. Again, I'm not saying you shouldn't have it. I will just point out, because there's only 35 lands in this deck, it isn't like there's 37 or 38 or something where you're probably more likely to have a couple lands in hand. I think things are a little bit leaner on the land count, and I think I would be worried you're going to get burned with it more often than it's going to do extra good. But I'm not saying I don't know that for certain. That's kind of hard to quantify. So it would be one I would keep an eye on. I don't run it on mono green deck currently, but I also think some people get way too into it's a terrible card. I think in some metas it's perfectly fine. If he's trying to win on turn 5 or turn 7, then I feel like it's maybe a little bit risky. So
yeah,
I just wanted to note that. The rest I think all look pretty good. I think Nykthos is going to be an absolute house in this deck at times. It is in my mono green deck, and I would guess in this one there's times it just taps for 14. Like, it's probably almost a better Cradle than in this deck.
Oh, for sure.
Okay, any more land business before we move on?
Nope, I have no other suggestion.
Yeah, I mean, it's a monocolor deck. There's just only so many cards you can run for utility lands, particularly when you are looking to do mana doubling things. You want to have a lot of basics, and I think it's a pretty good match here. I will mention the fetch lands. There are 4 fetches. There's a Verdant Catacombs, Windswept Heath, Wooded Foothills, and Misty Rainforest. He's just going to get basics with those. There's no other lands with a basic subtype here, and that's basically to get a free shuffle, and deck cleaning really doesn't necessarily work with fetches, but there is a scroll rack in here. I think that's probably the main purpose they serve to a degree, is it gives you that shuffle off a scroll rack, so I will note that as well. How about artifacts, Max? You want to read them to us?
Yeah, so we have 8 artifacts. We have Caged Sun, Extraplanar Lens, Lightning Greaves, Mana Crypt, Mana Vault, the Scroll Rack that you just mentioned, Soul Ring, and Sword of Feast and Famine.
I'm pretty happy with all of those. You have a couple pieces of ramp. Mana Crypt and Vault are really, really powerful. Obviously, Soul Ring is as well. Cage Sun and Lens all double your mana. Sword and Feast and Famine kind of does. There's quite a few things here with Trample, and Sword and Feast and Famine is pro-green, pro-black, but whenever the creature that's equipped with it deals combat damage to a player, that player discards a card, which isn't that important, and you untap all lands you control. So it isn't a doubler, but it kind of functions like one in that you get double use from your lands. I kind of like all of these. I don't know what I would change here. If Sword and Feast of Famine, especially in a deck that has a giant trampling commander and quite a few trampling creatures, that's pretty easy to poke through with damage. I don't know if there's anything I alter here.
I mean, worst case, slapping in an extra mana rock like Arcane Signet when that comes out in a couple weeks would probably just be good.
Yeah.
Maybe cutting something from your instants or sorceries that we'll cover later in the deck just for one more mana rock to get Ghalta out even earlier, or help get him out more consistently later in the game just seems smart to me.
Yeah, I think that kind of makes sense. I will mention Scroll Rack. I think Scroll Rack's a really solid card. I don't know if mathematically 4 fetches to get the shuffle off Scroll Rack is maybe enough for it. However, there's a lot of big draw things in here, like Greater Good that we'll get to in a little bit, where you probably sacrifice a creature like Ghalta sometimes and draw a bunch of cards. So in that case, Scroll Rack, I think, is probably kind of doing what my Sphinx deck does, where, yeah, it's a Scroll Rack, but you're mostly just digging down 18 cards deep sometimes to find a piece that's going to allow something disgusting to happen. So it's almost like a tutor rather than a Scroll Rack. I'm guessing that's mostly how it functions here. In a different deck that wasn't running ginormous creatures that you could sacrifice to fill your hand regularly, I would probably say the fetches aren't enough maybe for a Scroll Rack, but I think this particular configuration of the deck can utilize it.
Well, besides the fetches, there are 10 other cards in this deck that say search your library.
That's true. I wasn't thinking because there is all the different land ramp spells that do the same thing functionally. No, that's a good point. I kind of glossed over that, but no, that's definitely a good point. How about Grafted Exoskeleton?
Yeah, I think it just comes down to, do you want to be that guy with an extra infect card in this deck where he's already running Triumph of the Hordes?
Right, that's
which
true.
Will kill all your other opponents, where Grafted Exoskeleton, it's going to take 3 turns versus 1 turn with Triumph.
Yeah.
And also, it might just be too slow for this deck. It's 4 to cast,
for sure,
2 to equip, and then it doesn't give you anything but infect, so someone could easily remove Ghalta.
Right, that's a good point. Yeah, I think if this was a black deck, I think like Tainted Strike would be fantastic. But I kind of agree. That's why I kind of said Grafted Exoskeleton with a question mark. I don't know if I would run it here either. So, I think like there's so many things in this deck that buff Ghalta, you're probably going to be one-shotting people pretty regularly anyway.
Yeah.
So I think I kind of agree. I wanted to throw it out there, but I tend to think maybe not as well. All right, where should we go next? Should we go over to the instants?
Let's do it. So we have 5 instants. Beast Within, Berserk, Crop Rotation, Hunter's Insight, and Momentous Fall.
So 1 removal spell in Beast Within, which handles any problem at all. I mean, if you're playing green, in my opinion, you should be running Beast Within, whether it's a mono green deck or a 5-color deck.
Yep.
Berserk, I mean, Ghalta swinging in for 24-24. That seems pretty good. Or 24-12, I guess, but that still feels probably pretty good. Hunter's Insight, you run this in your Jamoka deck, I believe. Is that correct?
I do.
It's out of M12, it's an instant, 3 mana. Choose target creature you control. Whenever that creature deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker this turn, draw that many cards. So, I mean, obviously the goal is throwing it on Ghalta and drawing 12 when you clock somebody, but there's a lot of big beater creatures in here that it probably feels pretty good to cast it on.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the fact that most of these creatures have trample, or Ghalta himself has trample, really makes this card more effective than just casting it on any old creature that maybe doesn't have any form of evasion.
Now, the perfect place for it is a deck like yours, like your Dromoka deck, where people can't cast spells in your turn, because it's really easy to get 2 for 1. You cast on your creature, someone then just removes a creature in response, and you lose both the Hunter's Insight and your creature. That is never a good time. But in Dromoka, they can't cast spells in your turn. I have it in my Sigarda deck, where people can't target Sigarda, generally speaking, because she has hexproof. I think it gets put in your old decks a lot for the same reason. It's a much safer card there. I would guess, though, it kind of is safe here, too. You swing in and let people declare blocks, and I would guess people don't just take Ghalta damage.
What? No? Why do you think that, Dana? Why do you think
they
that?
They don't want to get hit for half their commander pool in one fell swoop. So I would bet it kind of functions as a safe spell here, because people will either just remove Ghalta, and if they don't, if they pass that priority, then you cast Hunter's Insight. They probably didn't hold back. I mean, I'm sure on occasion someone's like, okay, I'll take the 12 and deal with the next turn. But I would bet pretty often that's a relatively safe spell to cast in this deck.
Yeah.
And the last one we haven't talked about is Momentous Fall. That's just a 4 mana, sacrifice a creature, and draw cards and gain life equal to its power. Disgusting at instant speed. In this deck especially.
Yep.
The one I wondered about was crop rotation.
Yeah, I'm looking at that going, what would you want to go get? I mean, is it a way to go get Hall of the Bandit Lord or even Nykthos? Those are the only 2 lands I would go get with that. And
not that they're not good, because both those lands we mentioned, Nykthos might be as good as Cradle in this deck, and that's probably, I would bet, the case. I don't know, I feel like, though, there's not that instant speed, I'm going to go grab Glacial Chasm to turn off damage coming in, or that instant speed, I'm going to go grab Maze of Ith to stop a thing from attacking. Mm-hmm. I think it's a really, really good card, but I feel like it's maybe not quite good enough. Does that make sense here?
Yeah, I would feel better with it in this deck if there were maybe 36 lands and one more all-star of a,
yes,
you have to go get this. If this was more of a mono-green token deck and there was a Cradle in this deck, yeah, then I would understand. Yeah. But like I said, I don't see anything that's jumping out at me that says crop rotation for this.
Absolutely. And maybe Nykthos is enough, and I feel like Nykthos is in this deck is close to being enough. But then you have the problem where if you have Nykthos already, because there's a couple things in here that do get non-basic lands.
Yep.
Then what are you going to get?
You're shuffling?
Right, yeah. And maybe, okay, there's worse things to go grab at instant speed than Ancient Tomb or Hall of the Bandit Lord, maybe. I mean, I don't think those are bad picks. But I just don't know if that's entirely worth a slot. Whereas I feel like, because technically, okay, you're going to get ramp more or less in that slot. Presumably, that's going to get you a good bit of mana because there's no real utility lands here that do other things. You could run something like Carpet of Flowers in that slot, and if you play a blue deck, you're just going to get a gazillion mana just off the 1 mana spell you had out already. Mm-hmm. So I think if you're using it to go get Nykthos more often than not, I think I'd rather just run Carpet of Flowers for the same exact CMC and have it just make mana, generally speaking. Maybe in your meta it doesn't work that way. I think Carpet of Flowers in CEDH is a little bit different because everyone's playing blue for the most part, or at least a lot of people are. In non-CEDH, it's not quite as cut and dry, so I think it has to be a little more of a meta call. But even Wild Growth, no one's going to remove a Wild Growth that you put on a basic land. or if they do, consider that a win. If someone wants to remove your Wild Growth off a basic land, you should be happy they just blew a removal spell on it. And that's going to generate 1 mana every single turn, too, consistently, whether or not you already have the Nykthos in hand or not. So, I don't know. I don't know if I would necessarily make those swaps either, but I still just, I look at that card and I just feel like it's not quite good enough.
Right. I actually have a couple suggestions for crop rotation.
Yeah.
And they are definitely not 1-for-1 when it comes to CMC. My first one would be Shared Summons. It's the new tutor from M20. It's 3 green green. Search your library for 2 creature cards with different names, reveal them, and put them into your hand. He said in his notes he likes to be the threat, and if this is your way of showing you're going to go get Nulamog and Old Ulamog or Old Kozilek, that is the best way to say, come at me, bro.
Yeah.
I'm ready to win this game.
I mean, you are telling everyone that you're the threat, and they have to respond, and that's useful sometimes.
Oh, for sure. My other suggestion would be it's coming out in Throne of Eldraine, Return of the Wild Speaker. It's 4 and a green for an instant, and you can either draw cards equal to the greatest power among non-human creatures you control, so Ghalta right there, or a non-human creature gets +3/+3 until end of turn. So, maybe you don't need to draw 12 cards, but pumping Ghalta up to 15 to finish someone off, or, even if it's not for commander damage, doing 15 damage to someone in the face is almost half their life total.
Yeah, that's a great card. I was actually going to suggest that over in Sorceries to probably upgrade Soul's Majesty to it. But you could easily, if you wanted to keep Soul's Majesty, I mean, there's no reason to not, if you are, drawing a ton of cards and that's your jam, run them both too, and you could easily put that in the slot as well, for sure. That's a really solid card. And we talk about it a lot, so wouldn't surprise me if this is one of the ones you're going to mention next, but Heroic Intervention as an instant, I know he said he bounces back from board wipes, but Heroic Intervention is a 2-mana bounce back from board wipes and still have all the cards in your hand that you don't have to replay because you get wiped. You're doubling ahead. If you say you can rebuild that quickly, why not rebuild that quickly and have what you already had in play?
Yeah, I definitely think that kind of ranks right up there with Beast Within, in my opinion. If you're playing green, it's just an anti-board wipe card. The worst thing that's going to happen is someone counters it if you have a blue player at the table, but that's still worth risking 2 mana on. I
mean, I don't know what other card would be competing with it in the last 2 years of cards that I've seen that are new to the Commander game, ignoring commanders. I don't know if I've seen a card that's so wildly swung a game as many times as I have a Heroic Intervention. There's been so many times like some things happen and you're like, okay, this is where it's going, and someone casts Heroic Intervention and it changes the face of what was going to occur entirely in that person's advantage for 2 mana. I don't know if there's any card that I've seen in at least the last few years for 2 mana that so radically changes the face of the game as Heroic Intervention. So that, talk about wanting to be the threat and just hit long balls all game long. That is a home run really, really consistently. And we've mentioned this before, I know, but I'll say it again. Even if all you do is save your commander from dying, it's worth the 2 mana usually.
Yeah.
So
especially with this commander.
Especially one who costs, that much to cast, and it's going to require you to rebuild your board state to get that 12/12 back out there. Yeah, absolutely. And if someone's thinking they're going to save themselves by casting a board wipe and you Heroic Intervention, they probably just die next turn. Like if they're counting on that and you can prevent it from happening, effectively counterspelling it in a way that it's not even a counterspell. Counterspell would have kept it from happening. In this case, it's going to go off, kill everyone else's stuff, and keep yours intact. You're probably just going to win next turn.
Right.
So that's one I would like a lot. I would like to see here in this deck. I mean, I don't care how fast you rebuild. I think it's still worth running Heroic Intervention. Any more instants here?
That's all I have.
Let's jump over to Sorceries, since I just mentioned a few of them. We have 14 of them. There's a Cultivate, which is just a ramp spell, and its buddy, Kadama's Reach, is also in this deck, as well as its kind of buddy, Nissa's Pilgrimage. So 3 spells that go get a land to hand and a land into play tapped. There's Finale of Devastation, which is another semi-overrun effect. There's good old-fashioned Genesis Wave. There's a Life's Legacy, which is a 2-mana version of Momentous Fall at sorcery speed. Natural Order, a tutor that lets you turn a creature into another creature, basically. Pier's Whim. We like that card in the show. Rishkar's Expertise and Selvala Stampede, 2 cards we've also talked about plenty in the past that we're fans of. Soul's Majesty that I mentioned earlier, Template Discovery, Traverse the Outlands, and another one Max mentioned earlier, Triumph of the Hordes. That's a pretty solid array of sorceries in a deck as well. Like, those are a lot of really decent cards. Anything you would add or remove here?
I I like Natural Order and I don't like Natural Order all at the same time.
Okay.
So Natural Order is 2 green for a sorcery. As an additional cost to cast it, sacrifice a green creature, and then search your library for a green creature and put it onto the battlefield and then shuffle. I don't like that it's a sorcery in this deck.
Sure.
Because there's not a lot of haste enablers. And if you want to go get some of those Eldrazi that we'll talk about, all of those have cast triggers, so you don't even get those off of...
Well, you can't get them because they're not green creatures.
Oh, even better. See, sorry, everybody.
So you can't get... There's 2 Kozileks in this deck. You can't get either of those. There is a Ulamog, and there is a Blightsteel Colossus. So probably the 4 scariest creatures in his creature base are ones you cannot go get with Natural Order.
Yeah. I mean, is it just something to go get Serok the Hunt Caller so you can start giving stuff haste?
Maybe, but again, if that's the case, it's a 4-mana spell, and it does put the creature into play. But if you can't go get your big scary beaters and kind of cheat their cost into play by sacrificing that, Reclamation Sage or whatever it is, are you better off going to get the tutor you just mentioned? That's an instant speed.
Shared summons. Do that at end of turn for 1 more mana, and then you can cast them both the next turn.
Especially because this deck makes a lot of mana. Just cast them, get them into play, hopefully with haste, and do the beating, because you otherwise you just can't go get them with Natural Order. Now, this is probably one of those things like where maybe just going to get Serok or just going to get Selvala is maybe good. Yeah, then that could be. But if that's the case, then maybe just go, because they still don't have haste, even if you do it, because this isn't an instant speed spell, and the creatures don't come into play with haste. They just come into play. So if you're just going to get something that isn't super expensive like Serok or Selvala, then maybe just Worldly Tutor it to the top of your library for 1 mana and instant speed. You don't have to lose a creature, and then if you have the mana available, you can go grab Kozilek.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I feel like in this particular deck, with the way it's configured, Natural Order just might, I think it's a great card in a lot of decks. I think it just doesn't quite fit with the configuration of creatures in this one.
Right.
So that was one I had noted here as well. I mentioned Selvala Stampede as a card we've talked about in the past, but I want to read it again because I think it's not in a ton of decks out there in general. I think people may have forgot about it because it was in that conspiracy set. It has Counsels Dilemma, so this is a voting card, and each player votes for wild or free. I should know this is a 6-mana sorcery spell. So 6 is a lot. However, this effect is crazy. Whatever they choose, you reveal cards from the top of... So all this isn't like a choose vote either. It's you do the thing for each vote for wild and for each free. So for each wild vote, you reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a creature card, and that goes into play. And for each free vote, you put a permanent card from your hand onto the battlefield. So, okay, the downside here is you're down to 1 opponent. They're probably going to pick free. And so the risk there is they just made it cheaper for you to cast that Blightsteel Colossus by a couple mana. That's still not, that's not amazing, but okay, casting your 12 mana Blightsteel for 6 is still okay, because that's what they're going to pick. They're going to probably pick free. But if you're in a 3-player game and you just tutored up some stuff, people have to go wild then, and man, this card can be disgusting. I've seen just disgusting flips off it before.
Yeah, it is. It's a powerhouse, especially in this deck. It's so good.
And it's fun too. Because it's a little bit chaotic, but it's a controlled chaos to a degree. You know what's going to happen. You just don't know what you're going to get. And yes, you can technically whiff, but I don't think you're going to whiff much in this deck. Occasionally, you're going to hit a Llanowar Elves, maybe a Llanowar Tribe, and something else small, but really, really often, busted stuff is going to happen.
Yeah.
So I'm glad to see that card here. Tempt with Discovery.
Don't take the tempt.
So here's the problem with Tempt with Discovery. The optimal play, number one, there's 2 optimal plays. There's the one where no one takes the tempt, and you spend 4 mana to go grab
Nykthos.
Nykthos. And that's not terrible, I guess. But, we're just talking about crop rotation not being super impressive to go get Nykthos. I don't know if 4 mana to go get it is great either. There's also the risk where everyone just goes and grabs their strip mine and strips whatever lands you put down. And in that case, then you no longer even have them in your library. They're now in your graveyard in a deck with no land recursion out of the graveyard. So if you're playing against really, really good players, Temple Discovery can be a really difficult card to get value out of. Would you run it?
Well, no. Just in general, I don't run this card anymore because that's typically what happens in our shop is everybody goes and gets their strip mine, or they go get their land they need to win. Gaia's Kratos start dropping or stuff like that.
What is the land spell you'd run in Dromoka where we go get 2 lands?
2 lands, Hour of Promise. So that is 1 more mana. It's 5 mana to cast, but you can go get any 2 lands and put them onto the battlefield tapped. So I use that to go get Hall and Nykthos, or it's just a really good utility card, but it's 1 more mana, so that just might be too much for this deck.
So my thoughts here is I think you either run Hour of Promise and just go get the 2 lands you want consistently every single time and don't have to deal with anybody else making choices. Or if you, again, are using this for ramp, which I'm guessing it kind of is, then you just run the Carpet of Flowers, or you just run that Wild Growth that are super, super efficient and are gonna always get you mana, or Nature's Lore, or Sky Shroud Claim.
Nature's Lore, Sky Shroud Claim, even like a Rampant Growth, just so you can consistently get a land, since this deck is mainly getting the basics out. That's all it wants to do.
Yeah, and if you want to just stay mana for mana, Sky Shroud Claim every single time is going to grab you 2 forests untapped that you can then use. So basically it's going to turn it into a 2 mana to grab 2 land spell, essentially. If you have a mana doubler out, you break even. So
yeah.
I don't think I want to run Tempt unless you're playing in a meta where people regularly screw it up and then keep running it. But I feel like at some point they're going to not be screwing it up. And then I think you don't want it in your deck. So that's my thought there. Soul's Majesty I mentioned before. If you were to make a swap, I would put Return of the Wild Speaker in that spell. It's just more or less a better version of that.
Yep.
It's instant speed. It has the option to buff all your creatures. But I think the most important part about it is it's not targeted. So number one, if you have Lightning Greaves on your commander, it works around that. But probably the most important part, like we mentioned with the instant speed Hunter's Insight, you're much less vulnerable to getting 2 for 1. Soul's Majesty, again, it's targeted. So if you go to hit your Ghalta and someone removes your Ghalta, then you lose both spells.
Yep.
This doesn't. It just picks the greatest power among creatures you control. So if someone removes your Ghalta, it just drops down to what is hopefully an 8/8 or a 7/7 or something. Or even a 2/2 is better than it fizzling. Just drawing 2 cards off it is better than drawing none cards off it, which is what would happen to Soul's Majesty if someone removes the target.
Yeah.
So, maybe you can leave Soul's Majesty in for sure, but if I had to choose between Soul's Majesty and Return of the Wild Speaker all day long, there's just so many reasons to run it.
Yeah. I really like Traverse the Outlands in this deck.
I do too.
5 mana to go search your library for up to X basic land cards, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control, and then put them onto the battlefield tapped. Have you ever ran this card?
I never have. I ran it in my... that's not true. I ran it for a little while in my Mina and Den deck. Mm-hmm. However, I hit multiple situations where I didn't have enough basic lands left in my deck because I'd gotten them for something else. So it would be a 5 mana go get 1 land or something, or 2 lands, which I guess isn't terrible either, but it was way less splashy than I wanted it to be. So I just replaced it with something that was like a like a Nature's Lore kind of spell.
Gotcha. Yeah, I haven't ran it myself, just because I feel like you need a really high level of basics in your deck to make it worth it. I mean, casting this and getting 12 off of Ghalta on turn 5, let's say, that's all your land, almost all your basics. So I think that's really cool. But I would like to hear how well this card actually does work in playing with it.
If I'm gonna run it, this is the deck where I would run it. I'll say that.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I think Triumph of the Hordes is good. I know it's kind of a really really common card to run in these kind of decks, but Overwhelming Stampede is just one more card that just wins you the game.
Yeah.
I would be very tempted to find a slot for that in here somehow, particularly with a deck that contains Ghalta and Blightsteel and so many big beater creatures. I don't think you need an Overrun, because Overrun only gives stuff +3/+3, and I think, not that it's not fine, but like there are situations where that's not going to be enough. Overwhelming Stampede, if you're going to bother to cast it, it's because you've got something ginormous in play and everybody's going to die. So that's one I would consider finding room for. Like, I would, be tempted to run that even over a creature, maybe, because it just shuts things down. It's just GG.
Right.
So it's not splashy, and it's not like the kind of thing that anyone's going to be like, oh, wow, cool find, man. It's an Overwhelming Stampede. It is what it is. But, like, it's really tough to not run if you are playing to win in this kind of deck. That is all I have for sorceries, except for, I will note, almost all of the draw spells in this deck require creatures to do their thing, and that's perfectly fine. Sometimes it's just really, really nice to say 4 mana, draw 3, harmonize.
Yeah. There's
no questions. There's no muss and fuss. It doesn't matter if there was a board wipe. It doesn't matter if it's turn 4 and you only have a Llanowar Elf in play. It just draws you 3 cards consistently every time. Man, that kind of like payback that is going to wind up, filling your hand consistently is really tough for me to resist. I like that card a lot, and I think you don't want to go too heavily in counting on your creatures to make anything happen, because there are times when you're going to need to have the option to not have your creatures be your only source of draw. I'd be very tempted to find some kind of a slot somewhere here for Harmonize as well. Again, that's not a deep dive for us. Harmonize is a really popular card, but like there's a reason it's a really popular card.
Exactly.
How about the couple of Planeswalkers?
Yeah, we have Garruk Primal Hunter and Nissa Who Shakes the World.
This feels a lot like my Reki deck. I guess I have Garruk Wildspeaker instead of Primal Hunter, but I ran Primal Hunter for a long time in that deck, and I would guess this does the same thing that my Garruk Primal Hunter did in that deck, where I just cast it and then it immediately dies because I'm -3 and do draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. So I'm guessing this is functionally a sorcery spell. He plays it and it dies.
Yep.
And that's good. Like, it was great in my deck. I can't remember what I pulled it out for, but I'm sure I replaced it because I just wanted to replace. I wanted less Planeswalkers in the deck. I wanted to stick to 2, I think. And, I didn't pull it out because it was bad. It's a great card in this kind of deck, and this is similar to my Reki deck in a lot of ways. So I don't doubt it's a performer. Nissa has been great in my mono green deck too, so I have nothing to say about that as well.
Yeah, another mana doubler, so that's great to see.
And you could run, like we've mentioned, this Garruk Wildspeaker essentially being a 2-mana Planeswalker almost. He's never ever bad in a deck, but I don't think this deck needs him necessarily.
No, I don't see enough stuff where you want to untap except for Nykthos.
Yeah, so 2 good Planeswalkers, and I like them both. Let's move on. Enchantments. There are 8 here. Asceticism to keep your stuff safe. Concordant Crossroads to give everything haste. Defense of the Heart, which I will come back to in a few minutes. Food Chain, Greater Good. Mana Reflection to double that mana up. Song of the Dryads to deal with almost any problem in the game. And Sylvan Library just to get those early draws and filter that top deck. What do you think of this enchantment suite?
This is everything I would run myself.
Yeah, I've got no criticism about any of this stuff here at all. Song of the Dryads, again, is a really, really great card. Sylvan Library is great. I will quickly read Defense of the Heart, just because it's a little bit older and maybe kind of obscure. 3 and a green for an enchantment. During your upkeep, if one of your opponents controls 3 or more creatures, sacrifice Defense of the Heart, and search your library for up to 2 creature cards, and put those creatures into play. Shuffle your library afterwards. So you know, if it's early on and someone's got a couple of creatures out, you can just play this and go grab some huge scary stuff. You can go grab answers if you need to. And it's a great card. I don't actually run it in any of my decks currently. I don't think you do either, do you, Max?
Concordant Crossroads?
No,
or Defense
of the Heart.
No, I used to run it way back when in Dramoka, but it just became kind of too slow or almost more of a rattlesnake type card.
Sure.
And it's depending on your opponent's decks, which you can't always rely on facing creature decks.
Yeah. And the other problem here, you mentioned this earlier, but a lot of the Eldrazi have ETB or have cast triggers. So if you're going to get them Defense of the Heart, they're still scary Eldrazi, but they're not quite as scary because they're not doing their thing when they come into play. I don't know if I'm not saying it's a bad card in this deck. Would still be really tempted to run it anyway, but I think that's worth noting.
Yeah. Typically I would recommend something like almost Guardian Project would be great in this deck.
Yeah.
Since it's all creatures.
Yep.
Otherwise, something like Elemental Bond I usually recommend, but he only has 14 creatures in the deck that have power 3 or greater naturally.
Yeah.
So that'd be a lot of missing, where Guardian Project, I think, is just going to draw you a card every single time.
Well, or the upcoming Great Henge. That's going... Oh. It's not an enchantment, but it's an artifact, I guess, but it's functionally, it almost is an enchantment for what it does. In this deck, it's going to quite often just cost 2 mana to cast, 2 mana to cast.
Yep.
And it's going to, then tap for 2 immediately and draw you a card and put, it's a nutso card.
It is a nutso card.
So that's one I would maybe find room for here. I guess we could have mentioned it under artifacts, but for some reason I keep thinking it's a enchantment because it's colored and it does enchantment kind of stuff. But I mean, that would be good here. I would be tempted to run that over Defense of the Heart if I was going to make that swap. That's probably what I would pull for it.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of mana doublers here, and I understand why people are kind of afraid sometimes of Vernal Bloom. It's a 4 mana enchantment, all forests. Tap 4 double mana, all basic forests. The concern of Vernal Bloom is that's all people, and if you see other mono green decks, or even if it's not a mono green deck, you see a deck with forests, they also get to piggyback off that. I have it in my Recce deck, and Max can speak from probably personal experience here. There's absolutely times when you get to say, hey, I get to make an extra 2 mana in my Dramoka deck because of that Vernal Bloom. Does that ever come remotely close to whatever disgusting things I'm doing on my side of the field with Vernal Bloom?
No, not at all. There have been times where your Vernal Bloom has actually made it so I could play the game. So I appreciate that, but no, I've never, unless we accidentally get in one of those 2 mono green deck pods.
Right, yeah.
It rarely is that type of thing where you see it helping most of your opponents, where something like Urborg tends to help at least 1 or 2 players in any pod I'm in.
Urborg absolutely has fixed a lot of games for me. I've never cast Vernal Bloom in that Recce deck and then been like, oh man, that kind of backfired on me. It always, the 12 extra mana I'm getting off it more than offsets the 2 mana somebody else is getting. So There is a bunch of mana doublers in this deck. I don't know if he needs any more necessarily, but if you're not running Vernal Bloom in this deck because you're afraid of it helping other people, I'm here to tell you from personal experience, it doesn't help them enough to offset how disgusting it is in your deck.
Exactly.
This is a card we mentioned in the Maelstrom Wanderer show we did, which was Cream of the Crop, which is an enchantment that when a creature comes into play, you basically can dig down from the top of your library to what its power is and put a creature card on top. In a deck where your commander costs 12 or is a 12 power creature and there's a bunch of 6s and 8s and 10s, I talked about Scroll Rack kind of being functionally a tutor when you have a handful of cards. Cream of the Crop's going to functionally be a worldly tutor in a lot of ways. It's just going to go get the big scary creature you have and put it on top. It's one that I think is worth trying. I think this is the kind of perfect deck for it. You're going to dig really, really deep, really, really often, and put something else on top that when you go get it and cast it, it's going to let you dig really, really deep again. So I would like to see. I bet if he tries it, he'll really be impressed with that in this deck. Other than that, I mean, those enchantments all look really, really good.
Yeah.
Let's move on and take a look at the last category here, which is creatures.
The least important part of this deck.
Yes, we can just gloss over this one.
Okay, here we go. There are 27 creatures. Tons of mana dorks, like your Arbor Elves, your Boreal Druid, Elvish Mystic, all those just to help ramp up Ghalta by turn 2 or 3. Some of the more effective creatures would be something like Azusa, Lost But Seeking to help get extra lands out. We have all the Eldrazi, Kozilek, Butcher of Truth, Kozilek, the Great Distortion, Ulamog, the Infinite Gyre. So those are your 3, and Void Winnower. So they're all your Eldrazi. We have some extra mana doublers with Vorinclex. And we have Oracle Madiah to get extra lands onto the battlefield. We also have stuff like Selvala, which makes an absurd amount of mana in this type of deck. And then just some finishers, like Ronus the Indomitable or Omnath Locus of Mana can just end games as well.
Yep.
That's about all of them, though.
Yeah, I mean, there's some utility creatures here, Rex Sage, which is one of his few ways to deal with problems. That makes sense. There's either big scary thing, for the most part, big scary things or mana dorks.
Yes.
So, what are your thoughts about the suite of creatures here? Typically,
I'm not a big fan of mana dorks in EDH, but this deck is like one of the few decks where they are needed, to be honest. I mean, not only do they tap for mana to help cast Ghalta, but they help reduce him quickly.
They do double duty in this deck. They essentially tap for double mana in terms of getting your commander out. So because they count for the power and they tap for mana, perfect deck to run a bunch of mana dorks. No complaints there at all. There is no Crater Hoof in this deck. We'll mention that. And there is 27 creatures. I think Crater Hoof tends to be the kind of thing you see in a lot of token decks, maybe more than a creature deck. There is 27 creatures. I would say this, though. This is one of those decks where I think Pathbreaker Ibex is a much better card than Crater Hoof because it gives basically Overwhelming Stampede. It gives creatures +X+X, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control.
Mm-hmm.
Ibex isn't as good as Crater Hoof in some decks because, Crater Hoof in a token deck, like I said, it buffs off going wide. But Ibex in this deck, giving everything +12/+12 if Ghalta's out, or, 11 or 10 if, Vorinclex is out, or Kozilek or whatever. I think Pathbreaker Ibex is just one more threat in this deck that I think probably, for the most part, is going to just end games. I like Rampaging Baloths just fine. I'm okay with you playing Rampaging Baloths. It's going to make you some value tokens, and that's okay. And whatever, I will kind of that's it. I can ignore it for a few turns. Yeah. If you drop an Ibex in this deck, I have to deal with it, or I'm dead.
Exactly.
Just for the same exact mana, Ibex is a problem you have to answer, or the game is over. Baloths isn't. I think that's just a clean 1-for-1 swap I would make.
Yep, I completely agree with that. I'm kind of confused about Ronus the Indomitable, so that's the original Ronus.
Yep.
It's a 3-mana 5/5, which, he can easily attack because Ronus, Ghalta will make it, his condition come true. I almost think God Eternal Ronus might just be better in this deck because it's going to double all your power for all your creatures and give them vigilance. You can swing out. Most of the stuff has trample, and then you still have all your blockers for next turn.
I think Ronus probably just is a great mana rock, essentially. You play him for 3 on turn, 2, maybe even sometimes, because you got a mana dork out on turn 1, and that gives you 5 power towards Ghalta's cast reduction. So I'm guessing that's the kind of card that if you see it in your opening hand, it makes it super easy to get Ghalta out really, really quickly.
Okay, that makes sense.
Because you don't care, even if you don't attack with it, just being able to have that there in play. And it's indestructible, so when that hits the board, it's probably going to sit there for a long, long time, reducing Ghalta by 5 all on its own every single turn.
Yeah.
So I think I would leave that one in just for those purposes. But I do agree with you entirely. God Eternal Ronus doubling your power, particularly your commander who becomes a 24/24 and just kills somebody. I think I would be very tempted to go to have God Eternal in this deck. if for no other reason than to use Finale of Devastation to go get it and then double everything again off one spell would be hilarious. So I think God Eternal is probably worth a swat. I agree with that totally. The other one I was kind of thinking about was Grithama.
The all-devouring.
Number one, it's a really efficiently costed creature, 5 mana to take a huge chunk of Ghalta's casting cost off. But then if you are so inclined and don't want it sticking around so someone else can take advantage of it, it doesn't kill Ghalta and Ghalta kills it and you draw 10 cards. So I would be very, very interested to see how that card plays out in this deck as well. Other than that, is from my point of view, that creature suite looks pretty tight.
Yep, I 100% agree. It's not something I would want to deal with on a regular occasion.
Yeah, like I feel like I don't know how you shut this deck off. Between all the mana doublers and so many of the creatures are scary on their own, and then Ghalta just comes down off the scary creatures. There's just a lot of like internal. It's not the kind of synergy you're used to where like you're making tokens and the tokens buff this thing and do that thing. It's just everything in the deck is scary and it leads to more scary things happening, which leads to more scary things happening. So I mean, it's synergy. It's just not what you usually think of when you think of synergy. But I do like the deck a lot, and I just like Stompy. Like this is always going to be fun.
Yeah, this is something that. Chris is a big proponent of this ideology of your deck shouldn't revolve around your commander.
Yes.
And this definitely wants to use Ghalta as much as possible, but there's enough scary stuff, like you were just saying, that is all fine on its own without needing to cast Ghalta.
Well, that feels pretty good when your commander is a 12/12 with trample, and you honestly can win games without it.
Yeah. That says a lot about the card.
Yes, for sure. So, all right. I think that is all I have to say. Is there anything else from you, Max?
No, that's all I have to say as well.
Awesome. Brad, thank you very much for supporting the podcast. We really appreciate it. And thank you for sharing this deck with us so we could talk about it here in the show. Podcast theme is Retro Future Dirty by Kevin MacLeod, licensed via Creative Commons. The show is edited by Ken Peddle. You can find him on Twitter at LOAD3R. You can find me on Twitter at Dana Roach. You can find Max at CMDR_Max. You can find Chris at WiseSquishy1. You can also find us back here next Monday with another show. Until then, I'm Dana.
And I'm Max.